Welcome to Chax Poetry Talks, a podcast brought to you by Chax Press. This is Charles Alexander. I'm your host and speaker. You can find Chax Press online at chax.org. And now, the podcast. Hi, this is Charles Alexander again with the Chax Poem Words podcast. And this is the second podcast. In the last one, we started as far back as the early 19th century with a definition of poetry by William Wordsworth, and eventually worked our way back to the Tang Dynasty in the Common Era 700s with the poet Wang Wei, before making it somewhere back out from there. Today we're going to go a lot farther back. Where do you think poetry begins? If anybody wants to try to write an answer to that question, I would love to see it. And I don't mean begins in our practice. I know the poet Donald Hall was fond of saying that it begins with the child as still a baby making pleasant sounds to try to attract its mother's attention. And there is something of pleasure in a lot of definitions of poetry. But here I'm thinking more about historically. And of course, there's no answer to this question. Where does it begin? As soon as there is any recorded history, there is poetry. And as soon as there is any recorded history, a part of that poetry is the written record of work that had been oral, spoken, sung, etc., sometime before that. But about the earliest record we have is from Sumeria, and you may think first of the Epic of Gilgamesh, but even before Gilgamesh, a story which becomes part of Gilgamesh is the story of Inanna. Inanna is the world's first goddess of recorded history and was a deity of those ancient Sumerians. And she had hymns to her and also work that sort of records her speaking a poem. There's a fantastic book that presents the work of Inanna called Inanna, Queen of Heaven and Earth, Her Stories and Hymns from Sumer by Diane Volkstein and Samuel Noah Kramer. And that's where I take the text of what I am presenting today. And I cannot claim to be an archaeologist or scholar of this period, but just as a human being in our own, I find it clarifying, even revelatory, that some of this first poetic work we have is to a female deity or otherwise, and this deity certainly sometimes acts with what seem to be all the faculties of a passionate, real human being, and that some of it is in the voice of a female. You know, if you were to, my guess is if you were to ask people on the street what's the oldest poet they could name, it might be Homer. And this is before Homer. And this is brings up a voice that you might say the Greeks, Romans, and most of recorded literature until fairly recently has not been quite so open to. That is the full-throated, full-bodied, fully sexualized female voice. And this is fully sexualized. I want to quote from this. This is from The Courtship of Inanna and Dumuzi, where Inanna is seeking a partner in very forward, blunt terms. Inanna spoke. What I tell you, let the singer weave into song. What I tell you, let it flow from ear to mouth. Let it pass from old to young. My vulva, the horn, the boat of heaven, in full of eagerness like the young moon, my untilled land lies fallow. As for me, Inanna, who will plow my vulva? Who will plow my high field? Who will plow my wet ground? As for me, the young woman, who will plow my vulva? Who will station the ox there? Who will plow my vulva? And of course here, while there is a direct invocation of a powerful sexual act, there's also a sense that Inanna is goddess of earth and heaven. To plow that vulva is to allow agriculture. To plow that high field is to open up the earth for human partaking. Who will plow that wet ground is a hero of humanity or a god of humanity. Dumuzi, who's addressed in that question, replied, Great lady, the king will plow your vulva. I, Dumuzi the king, will plow your vulva. Inanna, then plow my vulva, man of my heart. Plow my vulva. I'm not sure if we get another voice like that into the literature of Europe, anyway, until possibly the work of Mina Loy in the early 20th century, and speaking of Pig Cupid in a very amatory poem. I think even while there's an open passion in the early Greek poems of Sappho, it is somewhat more poised and somewhat more refined. And it's possible that Catullus does give us some very frank and forthright pictures of human sexuality, both heterosexual and homosexual. And yet, Catullus is something of a satirist, and in some ways the sexuality he presents has perhaps other motives than just that act itself. And of course here, again, there is a mythical perspective, so it is not entirely just that act itself either. The Epic of Gilgamesh will include the story of Inanna as well as much else, but when is the next time we have a voice like this in poetry? If you find out, please let me know. So we've gone to the first poetry that the world has saved in the Inanna and the Gilgamesh poems. And I thought we would visit just for a moment the first poem we have in English, Old English that is, and it is a poem known to us as Cadmans Him. Caedmon seems to be a figure somewhat lost in legend. Some think of him as a saint, but he was never officially made a saint. As legend would have it, he was unable to sing and knew no poetry, and yet on one evening, asleep among the animals in his care, he dreamed that an apparition appeared, telling him to sing of the Principium Creaturarum, or the beginning of created things. He suddenly began to sing, and that memory of the dream stayed with him, and that is what we have as Cadmans Him. Now, I'm going to read this in Old English. It's only about 9 lines. That's all that have survived of it. There was probably more. I'm going to read this in an unpracticed Old English, but I'll do the best I can, and then I will read the translation. By the way, we know about Caedmon primarily from the Venerable Bede, one of the first, maybe the first English historian. So I should say Cadman's years are approximately 657 or so. Or that's the time that Bede writes about him. I don't think we actually know Cadman's years so well. Sorry about that. The version I will read is from the earliest English poems published by Penguin Books in 1991. Nu skulen herrigen Herfenriches werd, mehr Todesmächte und his Mordgedank, werk wulderfer, swahe wundere jaches, ecke drichten, or onstelde, he erst schelp earthen bearnum, helfen to rotha, heilig schippend, the middenjaard monkines werd, ecke drichten, after Theoda, ferum folden, Freya, elmächtig. And that translates as, praise now to the keeper of the kingdom of heaven, the power of the Creator, the profound mind of the glorious Father, who fashioned the beginning of every wonder, the eternal Lord. For the children of men he made first heaven as a roof, the holy Creator, then the Lord of mankind, the everlasting Shepherd, ordained in the midst as a dwelling place, Almighty Lord, the earth for men. Some of you may have heard in the Old English, Middenjaard, which is kind of a Middle Earth, and it is true that J.R.R. Tolkien, author of Lord of the Rings, studied this period of English history and literature, and actually did quite a few translations and studies of work from this period on up a couple of centuries. Okay, so we've had a time of beginnings, and we will have more times of beginnings. And I would again put it to you that you can get something out of speaking Old English and Middle English without necessarily having to translate it, although there's certainly resources available if you want to translate it. But I'm thinking it's a little bit like reading James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, which I'm reading right now, and I think following my own inclination, as well as a few people, Anthony Burgess among them, the novelist, advice to dive in. Don't prepare yourself too much. Don't read such works with lots of reference books at your side, but dive in. And I'm finding with Finnegan's Wake, after I've read 25, 30 pages, I actually understand more of it than I thought I would, although it doesn't quite work in a linear form where, plot moves from A to B to C. And if you read Old English, you will gather something from the energy of the music of the language that won't quite be like a translation or interpretation of the poem, but you can certainly move to that later. By the time, of course, you get to Middle English, a few centuries on, 1300s, an author like Geoffrey Chaucer, you start to understand the language better. Juanat marcha with her shores socta, which you might know is when March with her sweet showers, the rains of March, the rains of spring. Juanat marcha with her shores socta. And I have made a mistake there. Juanat aprila, April, with her shores socta, the drocht of March hath persed to the rota, the drought of March has been pierced to the root and is gone. And this podcast now has come to time to be gone. And I wish you many beginnings in poetry. Thank you.
1, 2, 3.